Now, Roman combat. We're going to talk about combat pretty much all day. And the main question that you'll need to answer is, what are the Roman innovations of combat? And that's pretty general, and I'm going to give you a lot of information. So Roman combat, what's special about it? Why do they think they're so special? So not only the physical attributes of combat, but mental as well. Where is Rome? So I just shout it out real quick. Where is Rome? Yeah, Italy. Good. So we'll just start with Roman attitudes on combat. So when you think of Romans, you want to think of a very militaristic society. They prided themselves on being warlike, but also almost a sense of righteousness. They weren't necessarily purely violent or purely hostile, though they could be fairly hostile. They had a sort of a sense of righteousness based on their own real and mythological past. They had a certain pride in the Republic, which you've already discovered. And I spoke about augury, how they stay right with the gods. And I was really impressed how many of you understood that with Augustus, that understood how important divination is, just to make it look like you have the approval of Jupiter or Zeus. So let's start off here. Augury. We already know about augury. Maybe someday I'll perform a live demonstration of augury in a class. It's very fascinating material. There are many ways to do it. You can read birds. You can read the sacred chickens. You can read a bisected liver. And what's interesting about all these forms of divination is that they go all the way back to the Babylonian methodology of divination. So the Greeks and the Romans used very similar methods for asking the gods for favor. And if we go back and really look at the Babylonian period, we can tell that they got those from the Babylonians. And maybe the Babylonians got it from the Sumerians. It may go all the way back to Sumeria, for all we know. Very fascinating. So when you go into war, even if you're a malicious Roman, murder is still an act of pollution, like we discussed in the Athenian law courts. So you can't just go out and murder somebody in the name of Rome and have it justified. You're still going to carry around a little bit of that miasma, that pollution, or what have you. So even in times of war, since the very beginning, when soldiers would go out and fight, they would need to be cleansed before they re-entered the city. They wouldn't want to bring that, we would call it maybe sin these days. We wouldn't want to bring that murderous pollution back into the city. So they would often perform rituals, and this is nothing special for Romans, but they were very austere and very ritualistic. They took pride in not only divination, but the spiritual cleansing after a battle. Now, one of the temples in Rome, part of it still stands. One of the oldest temples is the Temple of Janus, also known as the Temple of Janus. Remember that the Romans didn't have a J sound. The J's that you see in any Latin word is usually an I. So instead of Julius Caesar, it's Iulius Caesar. Sounds weird to our English ears, I imagine. But this Temple of Janus it's actually a small temple, and it has an archway that runs through it. So it has a door on either end. You enter in one way, exit out the other. The god Janus himself is a double-faced god, and you see this in a lot of Roman coins. You see a double face, and here's your coin. It's kind of one of the neater gods, I think, The Temple of Janus really early on was associated with the idea of past and future. The head looks both ways. It sees the past, it sees the future. But when soldiers, many historians think real early on, the Temple of Janus was used for cleansing soldiers. You go in one end of the temple and you exit the other, and you are cleansed by the time you leave. That tradition carried on, and so in times of war, the Temple of Janus, the gates are open. In times of peace, like during almost the entire reign of Augustus with his Pax Romana, the gates were closed the entire time. So it's very fascinating. There are physical temple locations that change depending on if its people are going to war or not. So it was a sort of a spiritual aspect. So augury before you go into battle, cleansing after you go into battle. It's tied up with spiritualism. Or let's just say religion. I don't know if spiritualism is a good word for that. All gods lead to Rome. That's my phrase. And evocatio. Now evocatio, good Latin word, it's usually used meaning to recruit troops. But in our sense, it's a term that's used for recruiting gods. So, in terms of divination, augury, if a general goes out, let's say there's a hill, and all the troops or the general, they amass on the hill right here, and on this other hill is the city that you're getting ready to sack, pillage, or what have you. And what this general will do, either the general or say some sort of priest or augur that the general has with him, what they'll do is they'll create a ritual called evocatio, where they will communicate with the main god of the city. Doesn't matter what god it is. Romans are not prejudicing its gods. They'll help any god, please any god, as long as that god will please them and help them. The Romans, you could say they're a very holy type. They're holy. Not in the modern Christian sense, because you can't say holy and be a murderer at the same time, but Romans, with their religion, they could. And so we have augury, the cleansing after battle, but we also have evocatio. So what happens is the general will address the god of the city and entice the god of the city. Because remember, ancients at this time believed that we please the gods by blood sacrifices mainly, but also little things like singing and other dedications and oath and dedications of little hot cakes at a shrine. But blood was the real factor with pleasing the gods. And so any major city would perform sacrifices, their blood sacrifices, and everybody would just eat the meat. It's not like the meat was wasted, I'll have to point out. But sacrifices are being made all across the ancient world to please the gods, especially places like Rome. They're really into pleasing the god and making sure they don't mess up. But they do that for their enemies' gods as well. In our world, when we think of an enemy's god, we would like to reject that god and say that that god doesn't exist, or it's just a demon in godly form. But no, the Romans weren't about that at all. They didn't have a problem with any religion until the Christians came along, actually. Those troublemakers. And with evocatio, you address that god in sort of a ritualistic manner, and you have certain things that you say, but essentially what you're telling that god is that if you move from your city that you protect, and you stop protecting these people, and not only stop protecting these people, but give them fright and terror so they leave the city, so they just abandon the city, what we will do for you is we will triple the amount of sacrifices we make to you in our city. We will move your temple and statues to Rome, which they literally did. And that's why I say all gods lead to Rome. It's that they would take the temple, move it to Rome, and really actually the state would pay to have sacrifices performed to please those gods. So they really thought they were doing something, and maybe this just boosts morale of their troops by sort of weakening your perception of whether or not these people are right with their own god or not. But Romans were very clever. They would take your god and move it to Rome. I think it's very interesting how this happened with mystery traditions in general. They became really hot in Rome, like Christianity, for example. Rome was kind of the center of the Christian world for a long time. So evocatio, recruiting a god. Romans also had a sense of superiority. You see this in their writing. It's not just an assumption. Romans felt like because they were naturally militaristic and well-trained and they can move in formations, they were very disciplined in terms of like military discipline, but also endurance in terms of like a triathlete. The Romans were really big into endurance training. That's something that's very respected with modern athletes, modern soldiers, modern combat artists. The Romans were very much knew that it was more important to be able to march for 2 days than it was to be able to lift a big rock over your head. And so we can actually look in some of the writings from the Republic and the Empire that there are authors like Seneca, for example, who's praising the military culture and the sort of the toughness and endurance of Romans and comparing them to the Greeks. Now, the Greeks are the type that get together in gymnasiums. They're the ones who came up with the word gymnasium. Gymnasium means basically a place where you train naked. Gymnos, the word gym, like we go to the gym and work out, it means naked. And the Greeks would go and work out naked. They'd oil themselves up and wrestle and box and lift weights and go swimming and throw javelins. And really, actually, a lot of your Olympic events today existed at that time. So the Greeks were really big into body display at the same time, So they'd oil themselves up, get really tan, even shave their hair. What does that sound like? A modern bodybuilder, right? They get really big and puffy from, high volume weights. They're not doing strength training or endurance training. It's something kind of in between, so they look big, And so the Greeks would be known to go into their bathhouses and lift weights and grunt and look really awesome. And what's fascinating is in modern bodybuilding, some of the big things that strike you as totally modern, like staying optimally hydrated, eating large amounts of protein, and also getting extra rest if you're a bodybuilder, the Greeks already knew that. We actually have text that has them oiling themselves up, hydrating a huge amount, taking lots of naps, consuming large amounts of protein, just like a modern bodybuilder. The only difference is steroids did not exist back then. But they did get big and puffy like a bodybuilder. We actually see statuary and photos of that. Maybe they couldn't rival the modern bodybuilder, but they certainly looked like bodybuilders if you look at the old classical era images. And the Romans would criticize this, because if you ever train for an endurance sport for like a year and then compete in that endurance sport against a bodybuilder, because bodybuilders, they actually lose their hypertrophy, meaning that puffiness, if they do too much endurance training. So bodybuilders, they won't do like 3-mile runs even, they'll do sprint intervals, right? To keep the cardio up. If they even do cardio at all. In bodybuilding, cardio is highly discouraged. Same with the Romans and Greeks. Two different ideals. Romans wanted functional, militaristic, toughness. And they would look at the bodybuilders and see it as superficial and vain and totally non-functional. And that has a lot to do with Roman attitudes on just about anything. I think those are fascinating things to think about. So let's talk about some physical things. The Maniple versus the Phalanx. The Phalanx is your earlier fighting formation. This is an image of a Manapool formation. But if you want to think of the Phalanx, think of men in heavy armor, big shields, long spears, shoulder to shoulder, tightly packed together, kind of like sardines. And they're all kind of running, marching together, and they're running into another enemy unit. With their combined mass and speed, they can mow over the front line of the enemy, the formation of the Greeks. The Romans changed that. They did use the phalanx formation for a while, but they began using a maniple. A maniple formation is really quite a genius formation. It looks a little bit like a phalanx, but they're not as tightly packed. The things that stand out in a maniple is that every soldier has room to hack and slash 360 degrees around himself, unlike the phalanx formation. So if you actually have, say, a phalanx attacking this maniple, even if they take out that front line, the subsequent lines will not be toppled because they're not all packed together, like, the domino effect, right? You mow over one line and the rest of them either create a divot or collapse. The Maniple prevented the main power of the phalanx by not packing themselves together. And they have room to fight around themselves. That's another point. In the Maniple formation, they would drill and they would learn to take different shapes. So if you look at the Maniple formation, they're kind of lined up in nice orderly dots. But you can move to different formations where if I yell out one command, they'll get behind each other and you'll create these giant long openings. This was really popular if they were facing a wide chariot that was charging your line, or elephants. We actually had elephants engaged in combat at this time. And the Romans could say a command. If you're in a phalanx, it would be chaos because everybody would be banging into each other. But with the Maniple, you could actually change shape of that. You can actually get these guys to move behind each other, and you could actually literally create a pathway in between. You can also create a checkerboard-like formation, which prevents you from being flanked if you have people on, all sides. So you can yell out a command and this Manapool will take the shape that's appropriate for the engagement that is happening at the time. Much more advanced than a Phalanx. Also, these Roman soldiers are full-time soldiers, unlike a lot of these Greek soldiers. They get to drill and train. They're much more disciplined. They're career soldiers. Physical innovations. I forgot my fake sword. I was going to stab some people and stuff, but I'll just talk. Advancements to armor. Okay, so armor, we already know the Greeks had heavy armor. The Romans have a similar style of armor. They're not quite decked out in pure iron like later medieval knights will be. But the Romans have a special helmet. One feature is that it's curved in the back, preventing blows to the back of the head. Another feature, and this is really important for troops, is that there's an opening for your ears. The helmet doesn't go over your ears. There's a flap that comes down that has usually a hinge, but there's an opening for your ears. You have to be able to hear commands, because these troops are highly based on hearing the commander and changing formation quickly. That's their advantage. Their discipline is their advantage. They're not stronger or larger or have better weapon than Celtic warriors. They're more disciplined and orderly. The Celtic warriors, one-on-one Celtic warriors, would just destroy the average Roman. So that's some of the innovations to the helmet. And those are really big deals. Protection to the back of the head and the ability to hear. Innovations to the shield. Remember your big hoplite shield. Its innovation was that it was rather large. You could protect the hoplite in the phalanx position. But the new Roman shield is even bigger and heavier. It has a slight curve to it, bigger and heavier, but it also has quite a curve to it actually, to help you protect yourself on the side with only a small rotation. So in other words, you don't have to move your arm and shield just to bring it back here to block a blow. You can keep it right on your center so you're not fatiguing your arm constantly, because they are very heavy. You can keep it attached to your body and still stab people. So you're not, you don't want this motion happening if you're in a formation, wild swings. You want to keep it close to your body. The average sword in the ancient world is very short. Don't think at all of medieval knights. The early swords in the Bronze Age and even into the Roman era is the swords really only stabbed. When you're in a phalanx or even a Maniple formation, you don't want to have a huge sword, right? You don't have the arc to do it. The thing about the sword, it's not your primary weapon. Your primary weapon is a spear. You're going to do most of your killing with that. The sword is so you lose your spear or you're being toppled and you can draw your sword. It has to be short just to draw it, right? It also has to be short to kill. If it's long, what are you going to do, right? It's not a whole lot of momentum you can get into it, right? It has to be short so you can go right into a killing blow. The way to get a pure killing blow is you don't want to just slack and, you want to slash and slash and slash. You'll waste energy. But with a sword and a shield, you only want to stab, only stabbing motion. Under the ribs, to the heart, behind the clavicle, stab it into the neck, stab it into the eyes. If you're slashing, there's more chance you'll go off balance and be blocked and smothered. You just want to stay behind that shield and go stab, 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 stab. That's usually what the Romans did. They kept their swords pretty short, but eventually there was an innovation with the Romans and they had a little bit longer sword, but they now have the ability to slash. And so you actually have text that talks about how the battlefields began looking much different. It was much more gory. Why? It's because when you slash, you dismember limbs and heads, and you also create bigger gashes through the stomach area for guts to spill out and stuff. So if you're slicing off limbs and your intestines are pouring out, it's much more gruesome on the battlefield. And so that can be quite intimidating even. So back to one of those mental aspects. The Pilum innovation. Pilum is a type of spear. Remember I said your main weapon is a spear. And they're spears generally that you do not throw. The Pilum, on the other hand, you do throw. So if you're in a phalanx and you're carrying a spear, you don't want to, first thing you want to do is get rid of your main weapon. No, you're just going to keep a hold of it, right? And do short stabbing motions. Well, the Romans came up with a really great tactic. They have a Pilum here. This is your wooden shaft. And in that wooden shaft, there's a little groove where a metal shaft comes into it. And it has a couple pegs that keep it in. And the wood shaft ends, and it looks almost like one of those whaling harpoons. The metal tip comes out here, and this is a Pilum. Looks like a little harpoon. Now this is a very, very unique design. It's designed to break. The Pilum is special because it's designed to break. So remember, when the Romans are fighting another unit, they're usually fighting another unit with big shields, at least on the front line. So what the Romans would do is they would get their own front line and they'd all throw their Pilums at the same time. And so the Pilums, they weren't aiming, because if you're behind a shield, you don't expect to get a good headshot or body shot when you throw a spear at somebody. They were literally aiming for the flush of the shield. What a waste of a spear, right? Well, no. You get 1 or 2 or 3 of those stuck in your shield, you're not moving forward anymore. These break when they hit. So you actually have a metal shaft in your shield and a big broken stick attached to it that's dragging on the ground. So you have to spend time breaking it off. So even when you get the wood off of it, you still have the metal shafts hanging out of your shield, you know. So what you would essentially do is ruin the front line. You would slow down the front line of your enemy, and you would destroy their mobility once they get closer to you. Their shields are heavier. There's so many negative points to having a ton of broken Pilum in your shield. Another reason that it breaks is, I guess, the most obvious. It can't be thrown back, right? Some of your troops who were poor, they were called Peltasts, and they would just throw things. They didn't have heavy armor. They didn't fight one-on-one combat. They would just have a bunch of spears, really small spears, only like maybe a 3-foot wooden shaft. And similar to the Pilum, these Peltasts would have a really thin, almost like tin can thin spear tip. Not quite that thin, not aluminum by any means. But it would be destroyed as well when you threw it. The tip would be destroyed. So other people couldn't throw it back. What's the advantage of throwing something when somebody could pick it up and just throw it back at you? Sort of mentality. So they had breakable spears. Pretty neat. That's the Pilum innovation. Destroying the mobility of the front line. It sticks into the shield. Disposable Peltast spears. Okay, the Roman saddle. Any of you equestrian athletes know about the Roman saddle? The Roman saddle is made for combat. It's actually quite short, so it's not a big seat. And if you look at like a modern day Western saddle, you got kind of a knob in the front. Well, the Romans would have had a much smaller saddle, but they would have knobs on each corner. So, right, so here are your hips, here's the saddle, kind of a weird upper view. And these knobs are really your corners of the saddle. Like if you were to make one, because, you know, a leather saddle, right, you would form the leather so it comes up, like here's my saddle, I sit here, the pieces of leather would rise up on the 4 corners essentially. And it's really close to your hip. This is actually way too big for the scale, for this little imaginary hip structure here. And the knobs are really more like on the sides of your hips. Pretty simple. Why would that be? Why would you, and this has to do with combat, why would you have knobs? Hold you in place, but also when you go to hack down, it helps you position, so you can rest on one knob or the other knob, so you can go to all 4 corners to attack. And if you know much about, like, especially like Roman fighting on a horseback is much more like what modern equestrian art? Dressage. Who said dressage? Did you say dressage? Very good. Now, the difference between dressage and, say, maybe an amateur doing Western saddle is that somebody who doesn't really ride very much, they use the reins too much, right? They're jerking the horse's head all over the place. Well, you can't do that in fight. You can't control your horse with your hand, and, So like with dressage, you usually have torsion on your elbow so it stays close to your body. And a lot of the slack and information you give to the horse is a very small motion. The hand stays in the center, and there's, motions with your legs and hips that you'll do to control the horse. This comes from combat. So you have to be able to control the horse. Like, I can do this one small motion here, and I can make the horse fold almost in half and turn without saying a word. So I can make the horse do all sorts of funky motions and turns without saying anything, with a slight movement of the rein and a slight squeezing of the hips. This is for combat. The saddle's very similar. It keeps you on the horse, keeps control without having to fly everywhere. If these knobs aren't over there and you're leaning down, chances are you're going to yank that rein. You definitely don't want to do that during combat. What you might just say is that the Roman saddle had 4 knobs to help stabilize the fighter, simply put.